I'm Augusta DeLomo here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is October 28th, 2023, and we are in New York City. And we are interviewing Suzanne LaFeber Kahl. And Suzanne, will you please introduce yourself to us?
Yes, I'm Suzanne LaFeber Kahl, and I'm Walt LaFeber's daughter.
Can you start for us telling us a little bit about your relationship with your father?
So, my dad was a wonderful father and, very involved and engaged with us. Mm-hmm. And really, we had no idea of the magnitude of what he was to others and in the Cornell community, because he basically would, at home, he was very much a dad who took part in family events, activities, and there was never any quizzing about history or discussions of current events at the dinner table. It was very much centered on what we were doing and our lives. And so to me, I think that was a great gift to us. It wasn't until I got older that I realized exactly how others perceived him and loved him and what they, how big a person he was in Ithaca and at Cornell. Because to me, he was very humble and always very modest about his achievements and his kind of life also beyond Cornell, of his lectures and writing and his TV work on documentaries, his travels around the world, lecturing. So we just really we weren't made super aware of that side of him, which I think was a gift to us.
Do you have any specific moments where you remember thinking, okay, my father is kind of this big intellectual deal, having those moments of saying, oh wow, he's not just the guy that's at home with us, coming to our events and talking with us around the table?
Yes, well, I think there were moments like that when I would tag along and maybe decide I would attend his class at Cornell. And when I would walk in and suddenly see, hundreds of students with rapt attention on a Saturday morning, and the standing ovations following the lectures, and hundreds then kind of rushing the podium afterwards to sign up for a meeting or talk to him. Also, it became apparent that not everybody had people like Daniel Ellsberg for dinner or ambassadors to dinner on a regular basis, academics from Russia and all over the world coming into the living room and speaking with his students or for receptions. I began to realize that, yes, there was another side to him, and I was very fortunate to be part of that. And but then I thought everybody grew up this way, and I think particularly the environment at Cornell and in Ithaca, with Cornell and Ithaca College. I mean, I grew up basically as a faculty brat, and most of my friends were children of faculty, and it was kind of a rarefied air to grow up in, because my friends' parents were either Pulitzer Prize winners or Nobel Prize winners, or they were all world-renowned teachers, scholars, and it just became very, mundane to me to walk into my friend Anna Lowy's house and have Ted Lowy talking into his dictaphone, dictating his book, or walking into Andrea Bilson's house and seeing Malcolm Bilson's grand piano in the living room. And but it was very much the everyday life that we had. And now looking back, I realize how incredible it was to be surrounded by all of this amazing talent and and people who were so interesting, not just in their own fields, but they had so many interests outside. So music, a lot of them were musicians. They had interest in art and theater and literature, and that was my dad as well. It was not just focused on what their field of study was. I mean, many of these people were, just had interest and curiosity in so many other areas. And I think that was also a great gift that my dad had, was that he, his life was history and foreign policy and writing about that and teaching it. But, our house was full of books. And he had this curiosity that he loved learning about music and art and sports and literature, as I said. And we made frequent trips to Washington and New York to see art exhibits, go to concerts. And so that was, and shows as well. And so he had this curiosity that he passed on, that it wasn't enough to just be focused on one thing in life. You really needed to understand to understand culture and politics and world events as well as history. And so, but it wasn't something that was, expected of us in the house. We were just surrounded by it. And so I think that's something that I've carried with me, and it was important to him. I mean, the story that I remember is, all my friends were going to Disney World when they were 9, 10, 11, and my dad decided that we were going to go to the Soviet Union, and so he packed up the family in 1975 and took us into the Soviet Union, where Americans were really not allowed or welcome without a huge visa process. But because he had a connection with an academic, Nikolai Bukovitnov in Moscow, who was kind of my dad's counterpart at, I think it was Moscow State University, or I can't remember the institute exactly, but so there was our family in the Soviet Union in 1975. And we realized that we were the only Americans in Moscow, as far as we could tell, and they would put us on a tour bus to show us exactly what they wanted us to see, and we were the only ones on the tour bus. And meanwhile, my dad was perfectly, he loved this. He loved going in and experiencing these places that he was writing about and researching. And to him, this was, the greatest gift he could give us. Well, at 11 years old, it was like we were on another planet. But then, 20 years later, I have 2 degrees in Russian studies. So it was that kind of journey. And those were the priorities for him. To take us to these places and give us that experience at the same time he was doing his work and research.
I love the way that you talked about his wide-ranging curiosity, that it wasn't just the field of foreign policy, but it was an appreciation for all kinds of questions. And I'm curious how you see that in the way that you approach your work now, and the way that you see the world, and how you go about your intellectual life.
So I think first and foremost, my dad instilled a certain amount of healthy skepticism in me, especially as I began studies from high school through college. It wasn't enough to listen to the news. To him, it was important to do primary research, look into the resources that were going to give a better sense of historical perspective than than sound bites on the news at night. And so I think I grew up learning that it was important to read and to look at a variety of sources and understand the world events from different perspectives, and not always believe exactly what was coming out of CNN every night. And I think that was a valuable gift to me, that he felt very strongly about that, and he subscribed to dozens of periodicals, and would read every day to get a variety of perspectives. And then when the internet came, then he would get those periodicals on the internet and he would read all of those. And so I think, as well as his traveling to do research all over the world, to make sure that he was getting those primary resources to understand history and current events from a deeper angle, I think was really a gift to me.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the standing ovations after lectures. As you said, that's rare even amongst academics, and we've heard a lot from other people about your father as a teacher, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you perceived him as a teacher in those moments, seeing him lecturing, but also what you experienced of him teaching you and parenting you.
So I saw his generosity of time and willingness to sit and talk with any student or any colleague who would come and want advice or guidance. And that, we sensed that very early on, because his time was so consumed at Cornell, just not by only teaching, but the long office hours, and that time that he spent with students, as a mentor and an advisor to him, that we knew that was a very important part of his time at Cornell. I think for me, early on in junior high school, he would help type up my papers, and I learned to write with him, basically. And he would sit, and it wasn't just, he wouldn't edit at will, he would just point out, grammar, and this is how you should construct this sentence, and this is how you set up a thesis. And that started early on in middle school, through high school and college. He would take me into the stacks at Olin, and even if it was a very simple assignment in history and in high school, he said, well, we're going to go to Olin, and I'm going to show you where you can find primary resources for this paper, the 3-page paper, and then we would go up in the stacks, and we would take out the books, the dusty books, and we'd go down, and he'd give me the index cards, and I would, he taught me very much his method, which was to write down what we were picking out of the books, and then line them all up for a paper or whatever we needed to hand in, and then he would, kind of guide me through that, but not over, I don't think there was a lot of inserting of his own opinion or knowledge. He was very good that way. Mm-hmm. But that was my experience. I mean, and just learning how to write and how to research.
Yeah, I'm struck by just his generosity with his time, as you were describing, not just with his students, but also with you, talking about pretty clear demarcations of, he was in the family and was not Professor LaFeber, he was your father. And did you have a sense of how he did that? Like how he, put things on the shelf, or how he would create those demarcations, even as your house was this intellectual space where you're having Russian ambassadors coming in?
Right. So there are a couple things. I sometimes felt like he was such a public persona for so much of the day, that he had to lecture, that he had to be there for, all of these students and collaboration with colleagues. And I think when he walked into the house, he, as a combination of just not wanting to do that and leave that at the door, but also I think his immense modesty. He just never spoke about the, accolades or achievements or, that whole side was just, that was not who he was at the house. And so I think, it certainly made growing up, I think, a little more normal and just a normal family household in many ways, except that we were surrounded by, thousands of books and as I said, and all of these amazing trips and meeting people.
Were there specific interests that the two of you shared?
Well, later on, Russian studies, and it was fun when I would be researching my papers or theses, and as a master's student to talk to him and get his views, and then surprise, have him kind of ask about what my work was about. So that was definitely part of it. And in I think it was 1991, when he called me up and right after the wall, 1991. So I was working as an arms control analysis in Boston, and he said, well, I think we have some mutual interest maybe in just going over to Eastern Europe and, seeing what we can come up with in our fields. And he said he had some academics in Prague and Budapest and Berlin and Krakow and Warsaw, and would I like to go along and then maybe make some appointments in the defense ministries and travel together. And so that is one of the most wonderful memories I have, are of the two of us kind of going to Budapest and Prague and then the train trips in between and washing our socks out together in our hotel room and laying them, to dry. And then in the morning he would go off to the Interior Ministry or a university, and I would go to the Defense Ministry. And at that time, people were just kind of sitting around not knowing what to do, because suddenly all the secrecy was gone. What was going to come next wasn't clear as Eastern Europe began to move towards independence. So we both kind of hit the jackpot, and we would come back in the evening and talk about, these people just kind of handed over, defense information and information on conventional weapons or probably papers that never would have been released normally, but we had just hit them at the right time where they were ready to talk and hand over this information. So he was having the same experience, and we just had such a great time traveling and discovering what was going on there, and there really weren't that many people who were calling up these places and saying, "Can we come in and talk to you?" So
what an incredible experience!
It was great.
Did anything come out of that? Like, did you use that for your work, and did he use that for his work, or was it just let's just go and see, pure exploration?
No, definitely. He was always in research mode, and so he was always collecting. Information for books that he had in the pipeline. And so he was very much into gathering that type of information and primary resources, of course, that we were coming across. And then in my work with arms control analysis, which was kind of all mysterious up until the fall of the Soviet Union. We were all kind of, trying to read the tea leaves and glean one or two facts or information from what was going on with military and Soviet military in Eastern Europe, and then all of a sudden we had people just sort of just take. We don't know what to do with this information now. So I took that back and handed it over to my colleagues at the institute where I was, and it was quite amazing. And then it was a special time with him because we really never had time for just the two of us a lot because he was so busy, and then I had moved to college and graduate school. So it was a very it was a unique and special time for me to spend with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this beautiful intersection of intellectual and personal, describing washing the socks out and then going to the defense ministry. I mean, what a magical trip.
Yes. No, absolutely. But then there were also the trips to Wrigley Field, and where he would take me and we would just drive into Chicago. I mean, there was the history part, but then there was the part that he wanted to share this great love of his, of baseball. And we would just sit at Wrigley Field, and he taught me how to score a game, and we would just pass hours away, and he would tell me about his favorite players and tell me what to look for on the field. I mean, he really became a fan, but a great teacher of the game as well. And so that was a great gift.
Did the fan of baseball, did it stick? Are you also a big baseball fan?
Oh, absolutely. So I became a Red Sox fan, but I was always a Cubs fan as well. And when they made it into the playoffs, it was 2015, I think, when I said it looked like they may go to the World Series, but the Mets were in the way, as I recall. And but I said, we're going to go, and I'm going to get you to Wrigley Field, and we're going to watch them because they may clinch, the National League championship. And it was a lot. I mean, it was hard. He was getting up there in years, but we again had a special moment of being in Chicago and sitting in Wrigley Field and watching them. Although they lost to the Mets, it was painful, but he was used to that. But that was another memory that I treasure because he just loved being there so much, and it was. I think it for him it was just restored his soul in many ways to sit at a baseball game and especially share it with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've talked about this home as this restorative place of being able to come in and leave the public persona and all of the other things that came with all the status that he had in his career. One of the things that was really interesting as I read the volume is people talking about how much your father didn't love the public persona, that he did it because it was important to his work, but it wasn't his favorite part of the job. And several people have kind of talked about that calling him a scholar activist, he wouldn't have loved it. And I would love for you to reflect a bit more on how you think he saw his role, what parts of it he really loved, and what parts of it he just said, I have to do this for the job, but this is not for me.
So for me, what he always was very adamant about and instilled in us was that you needed to always look at both sides, so that he was uncomfortable with being kind of put in a box either way, politically or ideologically. So he always, that is what, was very much instilled in what I remember about him, that he was reticent about kind of jumping into taking part in, in sit-ins or protests. But he was very much about talking about how did we get to this point. And that is what we need to understand, is most importantly. And then you could derive from that where he stood. But that was a lesson for me that, he was willing to sit with students and talk to them about what was going on in the world that, that was traumatic or crises. But he wasn't going to kind of get on a soapbox on the quad and take part in that kind of thing. And I think because of that, he was called on in times of crisis or monumental events that were going on, such as 9/11, to kind of provide that more moderate perspective, to step back and see all the variety of angles and history, and to get people to understand kind of the nuances and both sides of the issue. Mm-hmm. And I think in many cases that provided, or it was perceived to provide a more calming influence or impact on the situation on campus, because there were many instances of students who, and it was just the nature of being a student, that you were very emotional and you would get very wound up about these things that were going on in the world that you cared about. And I think my dad was always a good person to bring in and sort of say, let's look at this and understand how we got here, but what may lie ahead. And I think it was, I know presidents of the university would call on him to provide that. And so, if that makes sense.
It does. Where do you think that comes from him? I mean, the stereotype of the academic is they're super dogmatic. They know exactly what they think. They can't wait to tell you. And what you're describing is your father is someone who is sitting and consuming all these things. And then you, as you said, you can derive his opinion from it, but he really wants to take you through how we get to a certain place. Where do you think that sitting with everything comes from, and this ability to pull together groups that aren't seeing the issue the same way?
Well, I think he said it himself. I think it's a quote that's been repeated often, is that for him it was the process. It was not the end point of the argument. And to preserve the process at all costs, and that process meant listening to all sides and seeing all perspectives, and so I think he said you have to preserve that process and value that process. And if you do become dogmatic, and if you do decide that you're going to tear down whatever it is you don't agree with, then you're destroying the process of really listening and learning. And so I think that played into it. That if you become radical and you become so fixated on your cause and belief in your cause that then that process gets shut down. And I think that's that was what my dad was all about. Mm-hmm. Is to be sure that yes, your point of view is valid, but let's also look at the other sides of the issue and understand other perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think that kept him from sort of being put in a box or labeled, or because and that is why I think he had associates and friends from all, from all ideologies and political spectrum, and that's why people valued his opinion so much, because they knew they weren't going to get, a one-line perspective.
It's interesting, you're describing, a pretty remarkable commitment across his life to this process, right? That it was always, that was the core. Are there places where you saw his opinion really change on various intellectual things over his life, where, maybe as he was earlier on in his career, you saw certain things, and then as he was later in life, you saw different approaches of things that changed, even in this commitment to the process?
Well, one thing that stands out, I think, was being raised in a small town in Indiana, in the Midwest, in the era that he was raised. Religion was very much a part of his life, and his parents were churchgoers. His mother was very much involved in the church, and he grew up having that be an important part of his life. And then he went to a Protestant college at Hanover, and he sang in the church choir, and you had to go to chapel, and so this was, again, very much a part of his life. And then even when he went to Stanford, he would attend church services. When he would go to Washington, D.C. to do research, he would attend church services. In Madison, Wisconsin, he was part of the church choir, and this is very much a part of, carrying on of how he was brought up. Now, something happened along the line where in the 60s, he began to question a lot of that. And I think, as he grew intellectually, he sort of turned his perspective on religion and its role, and I think especially with the growth of kind of evangelical Christians and that whole movement that grew from the 60s into the 70s and what we have today. And he very much became someone who kind of dropped out of practicing, going to church every day or having that as part of his life. And I think a lot of it was how that religion began to permeate politics, and the hypocrisy that he saw in how that was changing politics and American life. And ultimately he really did not have that in his life from late 60s on. So that's one kind of journey that for him, and he became, even more set against the kind of involvement of the evangelicals and the far right Christian movement in politics and in the presidency, and that was something that he really had an issue with.
Okay. Are there any, with our remaining time,
Okay. I don't know
are there? No. This is great. Are there any, other reflections that you have of, what would you say are the kind of big intellectual questions that you feel like stayed consistent throughout his life, that you remember him just like turning them over, of hearing things, him talking about certain, whether it's areas or kinds of questions that you just felt like he kept returning to?
Oh my goodness. I mean, this was not part of things that he really discussed with us.
Yeah.
But I do recall, a lot of thought and kind of contemplation in looking at the actual evolution of the university itself and of how history was taught. and how that changed from the 60s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And of course, we're all aware of how the universities have changed in terms of how they teach history and the different areas of focus that have come into being in programs within the history department and within universities. And I think this was something that he tried to understand and keep up with and anticipate, and I think that is reflected in his work. But it was kind of, how do you balance the historical tradition that he grew up with and that he was educated with to the changing times of how other programs, whether it was ethnic studies, gender studies, colonialism, all of that came to the forefront in terms of what a university was deciding to teach and focus on, to this day. And I think this was something that he really thought about deeply and tried to adapt and change, or even at some points be ahead of. So I think that's, if there was one thing I could point to, is that.
I think as our last question, just for time, what would you like us to know about your father outside of him, the academic? What would be your one thing you would want us to know?
For me, it isn't just about knowing your field. It's about having a curiosity in so many other things in the world. And I think that was, the greatest gift he gave me was to not just be good at your area of your field that you're an expert in, but to know and have that curiosity about, as I said, literature, music, sports, theater, art, and that is why he kept friendships from so many, business and law, and that he really felt it was important to know about all of that and appreciate that and have that kind of be part of your life and as well. So I think that is the one major thing that I grew up with and that I take from him and try to use in my life.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay.